Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Prime Minister Netanyahu prepares to meet President Trump at the White House, becoming the first foreign leader to visit the Oval Office in Trump's second term. China hits back at Trump's tariffs as they impose a 15% tax on US goods, prompting an international trade war. And billions of US aid in exchange for precious metals. Ukraine makes a deal with the United States. To our top story, and US President Donald Trump is preparing for talks with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House today. It is the first in-person meeting between the two leaders since the Gaza ceasefire and in Trump's second presidency. The two are expected to sit down in the next few hours and speak publicly to the press afterwards. I'm now joined by our correspondent, Nick Harper from Washington. Nick, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me. These talks have been held at a critical juncture for the Middle East. The Gaza ceasefire, Iran, Israel-Saudi normalization on the agenda. What do you think will be the main takeaways from the meeting later on?
Yeah, a critical day, Leigh Ann, when it comes to Middle East relations. This US-Israel meeting, very important to Donald Trump, but also important to Benjamin Netanyahu. The second phase of the peace deal will undoubtedly top the agenda, both men wanting to do all they can to get hostages back. But they'll also be looking ahead to what happens to Gaza. We've been hearing from a senior Trump administration official in the last couple of hours who says that Donald Trump thinks it's impractical to make Gaza habitable for at least 10 to 15 years. The official saying that Trump sees it as a demolition site. And you mentioned the Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization deal. That is going to be central to discussions as well. Both Donald Trump and Netanyahu wanting to move ahead with that, really trying to look ahead to see how they can make that happen at the same time as trying to push ahead with the peace deal in Gaza.
Yes, let's just talk about the second stage of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal. It's actually been put on hold, as we know, because Netanyahu is in the US. Is there optimism that the next stage will also progress smoothly and lead to a permanent end to the war?
Not huge amounts of optimism, certainly not here in Washington. We know that both leaders here in DC will speak about how to get the remaining hostages released, but there is a thorny issue about Israeli troops withdrawing from Gaza. Now, that's part of the second phase of the peace plan, but it's not something that Benjamin Netanyahu, and certainly not something that the right wing in his coalition wants to take place. They are still talking about the need to eradicate Hamas. They don't believe that that has happened during the course of this conflict, and therefore it will become a sticking point when it comes to the second stage of this. Donald Trump also telling reporters there are no guarantees that the ceasefire will hold. So certainly not a tremendous amount of optimism about things progressing smoothly.
Nick, Netanyahu is, of course, the first foreign leader to see Trump in a second term. Should we expect changes in Netanyahu's dealings with the US now compared to when we actually had the Biden administration in power?
Well, I think Benjamin Netanyahu certainly sees Donald Trump as a more stabilising force when it comes to Middle East relations. It is someone that he was hoping to win the election over Joe Biden. He also sees him as more of a constant backer of Israel than Joe Biden. That's despite the Biden administration's staunch backing of Israel throughout this conflict. And part of that has already been on display in the last couple of weeks, with Donald Trump suggesting some harsh restrictions when it comes to Palestinians, suggesting that the whole of Gaza, the whole of the West Bank, the Palestinians there should be moved out to Egypt and Jordan, relocating them away from those two Palestinian sites. Of course, Jordan and Egypt are pushing back against that, as is Saudi Arabia. But Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, at least in the past and during Donald Trump's first term, were certainly seen as firm friends when it came to pushing forward both of their agendas in the Middle East.
Nick Harper in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get into this further now with Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, Israel's foreign military special envoy and the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Fleur, good evening to you and thank you for joining me. First of all, I just want you to react to what Nick said there, what we can expect from these talks and also from a possible second stage of the ceasefire agreement.
But it's actually quite interesting because Hamas is claiming that the second stage of the negotiations have already begun. In Israel, we understand that we're waiting for the Prime Minister to return. But I think there's already something going on in terms of the second stage. And I think that's something that President Trump is very keen on. The Israeli public is very keen, of course, to bring all our hostages home. We have a family of 2 babies and a mother whose fate we don't know yet. And so it's still very raw over here in Israel. And we're expecting and we're hoping and praying that this second phase comes through. But what I think people are talking less about, and I think that the focus will be mainly on, will be a nuclear Iran and how to avoid it, which is in the interest, of course, of Israel as a result of the fact that Iran threatens Israel to extinction with their nuclear or future nuclear capabilities, but also it threatens the whole of the free world. And this is something which I think also Saudi Arabia will be looking at very keenly.
So do you think this is why the US President Donald Trump is expected to sign this new directive today before he meets Benjamin Netanyahu to restore maximum pressure on Iran?
Well, definitely that's part of it. He never hid that this is his intention. He did it in the first administration. It's the only thing which, in my opinion, makes any sense. The Biden administration were handing or unfreezing tons of cash to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the biggest exporter of terrorism. And again, you can deal with all of their proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Shias in Iraq and the Houthis, or you can actually go to the root of the problem, which is the jihadi fundamentalism coming out of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I think a lot of their talk will be about that. And of course, any type of normalization with Saudi Arabia and how the Abraham Accords are extended.
Will this meeting actually benefit Netanyahu and the political turmoil he faces at home and globally, do you think, Fleur? Will this see a changing point for him?
That's a great question because Netanyahu really politically is in a little bit of hot water. No, I wouldn't say too much. There are parts of his party, one of the coalition partners, who already left the coalition because they were against the deal. They were against the hundreds of terrorists with blood on their hands being released into freedom. And so he does experience some type of opposition. But the truth is that the majority of the Israeli public want to see the hostages home. And that is what we're looking at. And also, which President Trump, luckily, has mentioned enough times, we want to see the beginning of the end of the rule of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And as you've seen in the last few weeks with the hostage releases, it doesn't mean that they've let go of any of their power. And this is something very, very serious and significant to talk about, because otherwise, if they don't leave Gaza as the main rulers, then Israel faces an existential threat from Hamas in its southern borders, and we can't have that.
Yes, indeed. We did see Hamas very strong there at those hostage handovers. Trump has not given any assurances that the temporary ceasefire will actually hold. What is the expected Israeli outcome at the end of the truce? You've said eradicating Hamas. If that's not possible, where do you draw the line?
Well, this is actually a very difficult thing because Hamas is so integrated into daily life. It's almost impossible to separate Hamas from the population. They employ so many of the people, or they used to. You even have staff of UNRWA, a UN organization, which is completely infiltrated by Hamas. It's very difficult to separate Hamas from the people. And this is why I think that President Trump's idea of trying to create a temporary refugee transfer to Egypt or Jordan is not a bad idea, because that would also give the opportunity to root out those jihadists from the innocent women and children. But this is a very, very complicated situation that we're in. There is no alternative rule to Hamas at the moment. And the way I see it is the only real guarantee or the only real way forward would be to somehow connect the post-war Gaza with the extension of the Abraham Accords. If we could somehow get the Saudis and the Emiratis involved in the reconstruction or the administrative rule of Gaza, nobody knows better than the Emiratis and the Saudis how to start de-radicalizing their societies.
Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, Israel's Foreign Ministry Special Envoy and the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
Now, a trade war is brewing between the United States and China after Beijing imposed new levies on American crude oil, machinery and some cars. Those retaliatory tariffs came shortly after President Donald Trump slapped a 10% duty on all Chinese imports. Ishan Garg tells us more.
China is hitting back against US tariffs, targeting not only American imports but also business. Additional tariffs will be imposed on some items originating in the US. This is what a statement from the Chinese Finance Ministry says. It came within minutes of President Donald Trump imposing a blanket 10% duty on all Chinese imports. Beijing's tariffs include a 15% duty on coal and liquid natural gas from the US and a 10% additional duty on crude oil, farming machinery and some cars. Residents are worried the measures could make lives more expensive for people on either side of the Pacific Ocean.
I
think the end result is that both sides suffer. The US imposes tariffs and then our products will sell less abroad, because tariffs mean higher prices and buyers may be unwilling to purchase. As for the US, it pursues unilateralism, and it negatively impacts its own international influence, because it not only targets China, but also other countries like Canada and Mexico.
In what's being seen as a counter-offensive move, China is also opening an investigation into US technology giant Google for alleged violation of anti-monopoly laws. Though Google's search services were pulled from China back in 2010, the company still offers advertising to businesses there. Trump has defended the tariffs, saying China hasn't done enough to stem the flow of fentanyl, a potentially lethal opioid, into the US. Though China says it has tightened regulation on drugs that could be used to make fentanyl, Trump says he could impose more duties if the supply doesn't stop. It's a prospect that's raising concern for Chinese businesses bracing for the possibility of a trade war.
For China's small and medium-sized manufacturing enterprises, the impact is definitely significant because their sales in the US may decline. Americans might choose cheaper alternatives instead.
Though Trump's tariffs have kicked in, Beijing's tariffs don't come into effect till the 10th of February. And experts believe that gives the two nations a window for negotiating a deal to possibly avert a full-blown trade war. Ishan Garg, Al Arabiya News.
Let's chat to the assistant editor of The Spectator and host of the Chinese Whispers podcast, Cindy Yu. Cindy, a pleasure to have you on the show. China has launched limited tariffs after Trump imposed sweeping new levies. Will we see a repeat of the two-year trade war between the US and China during Trump's first presidential term? Or do you feel like this appears more measured the second time round?
It certainly is a little bit more measured, but I think it will nevertheless be a repeat in the sense that this is just the opening salvos from both sides. Trump, during the election campaign, said that he was going to levy up to 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. So what we're seeing today is really low compared to what he has previously talked about. Similarly, for the Chinese, their counter-retaliatory measures have been pretty limited and controlled in the areas that they're talking talking about. As a correspondent said, that it would be a week until they really come into play. So basically, both sides are dancing around this question of negotiations, and the Chinese side have said, basically, we're going to dance with you. We're going to see what you want, but let's talk. We're not just going to back down.
Yes, there seems to be a lot of dancing at the moment between the US and a few countries. We are awaiting Chinese tariffs on US goods to come into play, as you said, on the 10th of February. What exactly are they targeting?
So we have seen a range of measures from the Chinese side: 15% on US coal and LNG, liquefied natural gas, 10% on crude oil, farm equipment, and some large vehicles. But there's also been other non-tariff measures as well. So export controls on critical minerals that China controls the supply chains of, which America needs for high-tech industries like semiconductors. They're really crucial. Also an antitrust probe into Google's operations within China, as well as adding 2 American companies onto China's own unreliable entity list, a blacklist for companies, as it were. And finally, China has also complained to the World Trade Organization about America's anti-free trade practices. So the package that has come about in just the hours after the American tariffs came into action suggests to me that China has been pricing in this tariff action, this protectionism from President Trump for a long time now. You know, they've been listening to what he's been saying on the election campaign, and they knew what they wanted to do in retaliation.
Yes, they've had some time to think about it. But can we just touch on what you mentioned there? China's tech influence in the US has really been front and center. We have seen this, haven't we, with the battle over TikTok. China is starting, as you just said, that anti-monopoly investigation into Google. Do you think this is just basically tit for tat at the moment?
And of course, DeepSeek, which is catching up fast with OpenAI's ChatGPT, a development that a lot of American and Western observers didn't think was possible. I think we're certainly seeing a tech race. And whilst America still has the technological supremacy in the world, China is catching up fast. And so there's a real live question about what to do about this kind of catching up. In terms of tit for tat, I think with the Google probe, it certainly is retaliatory. China's been very vague about what exactly Google has done that is meant to have been antitrust. We see that in terms of American and Western players in general, China has done tit for tat in the past. If you think back to the Trump first presidency, hunt, as it were, persecution of the Chinese company Huawei. At the same time as Huawei's financial director Meng Wanzhou was put under house arrest, China put 2 Canadians under arrest, basically in China as well. So a lot of this hostage diplomacy happens with individuals and with companies. The TikTok question, I think, is slightly separate in the sense of, you know, why is America concerned about TikTok? And that goes back to the tech race, that actually you can no longer write off China as just a copycat or thief of technologies. It is doing really amazing technological things at the moment that is giving America a run for its money.
Yeah, we absolutely saw that, didn't we, with DeepSeek. A 10% tariff has been agreed on the US side, but you mentioned earlier Trump has threatened to increase these if Beijing does not stop the flow of fentanyl. He's spoken a lot about fentanyl, Donald Trump. What's China's response been to this?
Yes, to be clear, China doesn't export fentanyl to America, but it does export fentanyl precursors. Now, fentanyl being an artificial chemical drug is created in labs rather than harvested, as it were. And so the chemical compounds that go into fentanyl, a lot of them are being exported from China. Now, this has been an ongoing thorn in the side of US-China relations for years now. Joe Biden tried to get on top of it. It was one of the main things that Xi and Joe Biden talked about in San Francisco when they met there a couple of years ago. But China has always said it's really hard to get on top of these precursors because the chemical compound can simply change very quickly. So if you put in a law banning one kind of compound, a similar but not the same kind of compound can be created by these kind of labs that are exporting them. And now, the Americans don't believe this and blame China for not having having the political will to crack down on the issue. So I think with this trade war waging now, we'll see who's right, because President Trump is basically forcing them to put their money where their mouth is and say, well, if you care about it so much and here's a bit of a pressure on you, then sort it out. And so we'll see how much is solvable from the Chinese side and how much really is a really tricky policy area for the Chinese too.
Yes, indeed. Cindy Yu, assistant editor of The Spectator and host of the Chinese Whispers podcast. I hope to have you back on soon. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. 10 people are dead at a Swedish adult education centre in the town of Örebro, 160 kilometres west of Stockholm. Police and other emergency services were called to the campus. Rigberska school after the shooting. Swedish authorities say they believe the shooter is dead and that he acted alone. Syrian President Ahmad al-Sharaa is visiting Ankara for talks with the Turkish leadership. The heads of state are expected to discuss economic recovery and stability. Turkey has offered to help Syria rebuild after years of turmoil and hopes to secure its support against Kurdish militants in the northeast. El Salvador has offered to take in dangerous criminals from the US, even those with an American citizenship. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says he would need to study the offer and has met with President Nayib Bukele on a visit to Central America. It's believed El Salvador will also accept migrants who are due to be deported. President Trump is planning a negotiation agreement with Ukraine involving supplies of rare earth materials in exchange for US aid. It's an idea that was first floated by President Zelensky in October as part of a so-called victory plan to end the war with Russia. Trump told reporters he wanted equalization from Ukraine for the response to the $300 billion they received from Washington. Let's go live to Kyiv now to speak to our correspondent, Stuart Smith. Stuart, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me. First of all, what kind of metal is Donald Trump referring to? How valuable are they? And what is he expecting to actually use them for?
Well, he explicitly talked about rare earth metals, which are a set of metals that aren't actually that rare, but they are found only in certain geographical locations. And what makes them special, especially now and looking ahead into the future, is they have some very unique electrochemical properties and magnetic properties that mean they're going to be really important for things like electric vehicles and motors, and also for renewable energy technology. They're also important in things like cancer drug treatment, scandium, one of those that's important there. And so while maybe one you've heard of tungsten, others, many of them you may not have. The reason Donald Trump might be interested in them is because China currently controls 70% of the world's supply of rare earth metals, and Ukraine has some too, but at the moment it can't get to them. So if Ukraine can get Donald Trump interested in potentially a deal based on providing rare earth metals, it may mean the US is willing to provide more arms to Ukraine in order that it can get its territory back under control and then potentially sell those metals to the United States.
We've seen the Trump administration freeze billions in foreign aid. This has clearly worried countries like Ukraine, who have been relying on the support of the US. Is this the only way to keep support going, by providing an exchange?
Yeah, well, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, said that he thought this was a very selfish, very self-centered move and suggested Ukraine's going to need exactly these kinds of minerals once the war is over in order to try to rebuild. But it does appeal to the very transaction, businessman-like nature of Donald Trump's politics, and indeed it was the Ukrainians that suggested it to him initially last year as one of the ways that potentially would keep him interested in Ukraine's survival for the war in for Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, one senior Ukrainian official speaking anonymously said that having a strategic US interest in Ukraine is a key component to Ukraine's future. So it's something Ukraine is up for. It says it's ready to sign documents about joint agreements, but this is just Donald Trump riffing at the moment. There's no particular detail about what exactly he's suggesting here.
Yes, we could be waiting for that detail. Critics of President Zelensky have accused him of caring more about elections than actually winning the war. There are reports that Trump wants Kyiv to hold a presidential election by the end of this year. What are you actually hearing your end? Is this a possibility, Stuart?
So here in Ukraine, there's been no formal request, some anonymous officials say, asking Ukraine to have elections by the end of the year, but it has been mooted. It was mooted by the Joe Biden administration as well. The problem for Ukraine is that an election poses a very good opportunity for any potential Russian interference and would only go further potentially to destabilize the situation in Ukraine. But indeed, it was suggested recently by one of Trump's special envoys who's looking into trying to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war, though it was suggested this would only potentially come after a ceasefire. But it's another one of those where a lot of ideas are being thrown out at the moment, but there's nothing official here being suggested from the White House to Kyiv.
Stuart Smith in Kyiv, thank you so much for joining me. Now, the US has expelled its first batch of illegal Indian migrants since President Donald Trump's return to office. The Trump administration has repeatedly raised the issue of irregular migration from India to the US in the last few weeks, with the US president claiming India promised to address the problem. Neha Punya has more on this.
A US military aircraft carrying 205 illegal Indian migrants reportedly took off from San Antonio in Texas very early in the morning Tuesday India time. The US Embassy in New Delhi has told Al Arabiya News, and I'm quoting now, the United States is vigorously enforcing its border, tightening immigration laws and removing illegal migrants. It says these actions send a very clear message that illegal migration is not worth the risk. Now, the expulsion of these Indians comes just days after US President Donald Trump spoke to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Back then, Trump had said that Modi promised him that New Delhi would do, quote, what's right on the issue of illegal migration. Last month, India's foreign ministry also said it would be willing to take Indians who are illegal immigrants back from any country as long as their nationality can be proved to be Indian. Reports suggest that both countries have identified 20,000 Indians who could be deported in the coming weeks. Now, Indians only make up a small percentage, about 3% of all illegal border crossings into the US, but their numbers have been growing. Many who are now attempting to enter America are doing so by paying smuggling gangs as much as $60,000 US, and most of these people come from poor families. And data shows that last year there were about 90,000 attempts by Indian nationals to enter the country without authorization. Now, experts say New Delhi is keen to ensure that it's separating the issue of legal migration of millions of Indians to the US from the question of illegal migrants who are in the US as well. Indians make up the largest group who are in the US on skilled visas, many of them working in the tech industry there. India is also hoping that its willingness to play ball on the migration issue is going to prevent the Trump administration from attacking it on the issue of trade. US President Donald Trump has repeatedly referred to India as an abuser of tariffs, but India has not been named in the new tariffs that have been been imposed against many countries by the US president. It's also likely that Prime Minister Narendra Modi will travel to the US next week to meet Donald Trump in what could be the first meeting between the two leaders since Trump returned to the White House.
Neha Punya in New Delhi, thank you. Let's take a look at the top business news. Volvo car sales fell by 5% year-on-year in January. The Sweden-based automaker says the decrease was largely due to the timing of the Chinese New Year. Volvo Cars, which is majority owned by China's Geely, also said the number of electrified cars was up 17% from last year, accounting for 44% of its total sales. Citigroup CEO Jane Fraser has told top executives that the bank will continue to allow most employees to work remotely at least 2 days a week. According to the Financial Times, Fraser believes Citi's flexible work requirements gives it a competitive advantage. Last month, the US President Donald Trump ordered federal workers to return to the office 5 days a week, reversing a COVID-19 pandemic trend. Turning to sports now, and in football, Europe's winter transfer window has closed as teams secured late deals before the deadline. Manchester City unveiled the signing of Nico Gonzalez from Porto yesterday to make their winter spending spree to over £175 million. Tottenham, West Ham and Aston Villa were the other significant movers late on in the window. And Phil Mickelson has suffered a minor shoulder injury during a workout in the gym and will miss the Live Golf season opener in Saudi Arabia this week. The 54-year-old golfer did make the announcement on social media. And a reminder of our top stories today. Prime Minister Netanyahu prepares to meet President Trump at the White House, becoming the first foreign leader to visit the Oval Office in Trump's second term. China hits back at Trump's tariffs as they impose a 15% tax on US goods. And billions of US aid in exchange for precious metals. Ukraine makes a deal with the United States. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. The dressing room is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burgess Watson with G&T. Good night.